Hi there, I'm Harper Feist. I'm super happy to be here under the auspices of the U.S. Grand Lodge OTO Education Committee, and I'm here today to tell you about one of Aleister Crowley's most infamous, most frightening, most transgressive rituals, the Cross of the Frog ritual, which he let us know it comes down in history to us as Liber Stauros Batrochus sub Figura Liber 70, so LXX. And with that, I am going to turn off my camera and disappear. Susie and I, are going to disappear, and I'll reappear at the end of the talk. So, okay, toodles for now. All right, we'll launch right into it here. So this slide asks, what are we actually doing here? So as with most of my presentations, this talk is going to go through a little bit of what Crowley knew when he wrote the ritual, a whole lot about the ritual itself. And in this case, I really wanted to bring up, before I dive in, that this talk doesn't wrestle with the ethics of the ritual. I myself have not performed this ritual, nor have either of my colleagues. That having been said, I'm absolutely cool with eating frog legs, and I know that my grandparents, for example, would have felt really silly about asking if it was okay to actually eat frog legs, although I will assure you that my very Catholic grandparents would not have appreciated at all the trappings around the obtaining of the frog legs. So let's look a little bit. So this slide, super high level. What we're talking about here is Crowley and his description of the ritual is in the first bullet. Let me read just a little bit past this though. Crowley states, the theory of the operation was to identify the toad with the dying god and to slay it. At the same time, I caused the elemental of the slain reptile, oops, even his biology was a little weird, to serve me. Now, this ritual was originally published in the Satanists and Eon II under the title The Initiation. And that's going to be really important as we kind of cruise through this whole thing. It's found originally in Crowley's Diary of a Magus, which is the urn, Liber 73. In Crowley's handwritten copy, he writes that the manuscript is to be given to certain members of the 6th degree in the OTO. So this presentation is going to talk a whole lot about the historical underpinnings of this ritual, and focusing on those that Crowley was familiar with when he wrote it. And then the other thing it's going to take apart is this issue of the initiation. Why is it called that? And in order to address that, I'm going to compare and contrast this ritual, Liber 70, with Liber B, and also a little bit with Vision and the Voice. And I will, because I can never resist, leave you with a dash of 65 at the end. All right, and with all of that having been said, here's the agenda for the next 45 minutes or so. As I promised, I'm going to discuss in detail the ritual itself. The ritual actually is Crowley turning a frog into Jesus. And you think I'm kidding. Basically, it's a pact with a familiar spirit. It looks very much like a old-style grimoire in this. But in this ritual, you can see the revolution of the aeon, the assumption of the grade of Magus, and also the assumption of the 7th degree in the OTO. I swear this talk isn't degree sensitive, and in the next slide or two, I'll actually spend some time convincing you of that. But one of the things I wanted to really dive into is Crowley's inspirations. So frogs and toads have been present as symbols of all sorts of things since antiquity. And we can list fertility, revivification, transformation in general, coming back from a hibernation. We'll look at all of these. Further, we know that frogs and toads were seen as imps of the devil in medieval and subsequent witchcraft, all the way up to Andrew Chumbly, mind you. And we will talk about some limited examples of that, including the toad bone rite and toad stones. I can never resist, when this ritual comes up, reminding people that frogs are basically interchangeable with princes, and the Brothers Grimm have reminded us of this. There was around the time that Crowley was dealing with this ritual, archaeology that showed there was a Coptic association of Jesus with frogs via the resurrection. And of course, as I promised in the previous slide, we'll go through Liber B kind of side by side. No, actually side by side with Liber 70. And also we'll talk a little bit about the vision and the voice. So before we go any further, let me convince you absolutely that this material is not grade sensitive. And in order to do that, I'm going to tell you that all of the words on this slide were actually extracted from the US Grand Lodge website, which is at the top of the page. The words in the first box are present from the ritual itself, all of which is on the online library. Now let me read this. This book, Liber 70 that is to be given to any knight companion of the Sacrosanct Order of the Kadosh 6th degree, who has given evidence of his capacity for it to a brother already possessing it by personal examination only. Such examination shall extend continuously over 11, and then there's some material loss there. Further, and this ceremony shall serve also as a ceremonial assumption of the curse of the grade of the Megas, 9 equals 2, in the AA. Okay? Now, also the bottom box from the USGL website is from a description of the grades. So this is the description on the website of the 7th degree. So we have here Theoreticus, and very illustrious Sovereign Grand Inspector General, Magus of Light, Bishop of the EGC, Grand Master of Light, and Inspector of Rites and Degrees. Therefore, nothing in this talk, and we're going to hash over all of this a little bit, none of this material is grade sensitive. Okay, so now everybody can take their fingers out of their ears. Let's go. Here is my synopsis of the rite. Perhaps other people would pick out different features, but this is mine. Crowley, he wrote it in 1916. He wrote it in New Hampshire, not far from Lake Winnipesaukee, which is where I actually discovered the mystery of booze cruises. He wrote it in a place called Bristol, near a place that I've actually been, called Newfound Lake. There's no booze cruises there. That's kind of sad, I think. But anyhow, so on the exterior of the rite, a frog is captured, feted, gifted, baptized, praised as Jesus Christ. And then the frog is released, allowed to hop around the house. I think Crowley talks about it running around on a blanket. Then it's recaptured, mocked, reviled, crucified. Then the frog is stabbed with a knife, taken off the cross, and then the frogs are eaten. The rest of it's burned, okay? And the burning we can see as kind of a callback to burned offerings either in the Bible or in Greek mythology. Now, from an internal level, all of this is still taking place, but what Crowley is doing with the ritual is turning the frog into Jesus. And then the magician presses the frog, who's now Jesus, into service as a familiar. And we'll talk a lot about this. I'm fascinated with the notion of a lying familiar. we'll get there. The frog's legs actually become a Eucharist to confirm the pact, and the burned body, one presumes, can signify the end of the old aeon and the beginning of the new. So Crowley actually says in the ritual that it's initiation to the state of Megas. So if we refer to Liber B at this point, we know that there's a line from Liber B, how shall he destroy himself? We presume that the burned body refers to both the changing of the aeon and the destruction of the pre-Megas magician. And here we see a line from Liber B. Let the Megas then contemplate each in turn, raising it to the ultimate power of infinity, wherein sorrow is joy, and change is stability, and selflessness is self. For the interplay of the parts hath no action upon the whole. And this contemplation shall be performed not by simple meditation, how much less then by reason. And here's the key, but by the method which shall have been given to him in his initiation to the grade. So if we're to presume that this ritual was meant to take the candidate from the sixth to the seventh degree, the methods are, as I just said, evocation, sacrifice, Eucharist, and acceptance of a familiar spirit that lies. Okay, so now we're going to get into the details. So why a frog? Well, first, as I mentioned before, there's a long history of frogs and toads as both magical familiars or materia. Have a look at the PGM, have a look at the Picatrix, and these poor guys, they take it in the short. They're used for a really wide variety of spells, and like from late antiquity up to the medieval period. But why is that really? So frogs are, they're just super weird. And if you are used to thinking about frogs, let me remind you how strange they are. Firstly, they're amphibious. They live on land or in water. Obviously, they have this super porous skin and they really like to live in or near water. That's important, but it's important to them because they can't reproduce without water. The larval stage, where they actually go from something resembling a very small fish to an animal with legs, it goes through a stage with gills moving to lungs and developing legs. That can't happen without water, or in some very strange cases, water that's actually embedded in the skin of the amphibian. Further, they hibernate, and some of these little guys can actually be frozen, thawed, and survive. Not so many animals on the planet can live through all of these stages in all of these places. They're really stunning. And the abject weirdness of frogs has been recognized for a long time. In the Bible, there's references to the Egyptians really liking their frogs. We know that Crowley was a Budge fanatic, and Budge knew all about the Egyptian roots of frogs and frog goddesses. Probably not frog gods, but we'll talk about frog goddesses here. Then, of course, we can move forward to stories about frogs, children's stories, fairy tales. And in particular, we know that the Brothers Grimm brought forward some really strange stories that had frogs in them. Just you wait. And like I said, their basic morphology is weird, but it's man-like. If you look at the picture over here on the right, you'll see Mr. Frog looking a little bit like an Olympic gymnast with a green head. If you're thinking about crucifying an animal, it probably won't be a wombat. So we're looking for something that has a basic man-like morphology here for this ritual, and frog is an absolute perfect thing. Further, there are 600 million of them in New Hampshire, and as I was joking previously, they are recognized as a food animal. A person can come up with a recipe that's not actually too bad. And here we have a whole slide about the weirdness of frogs and their role in Egyptian religion. So on the right-hand side here, we have Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad. They were my favorites as little kids, so they had to show up. And underneath Frog and Toad, we see the whole life cycle of what ends up to be a leopard frog. So they go all the way from the egg, the development of external gills, to the development of internal lungs and legs. Throughout most of this process, the frog itself is actually surviving on energy that's been stored in the tail. And then, of course, you know that when frogs are adults, they actually eat by flicking their tongues out and sucking largely insect into their mouth. They're, I hope that you won't disagree with me that they're really quite strange. They're very common in Egypt, where because of their reproductive cycle being linked to the presence of water, they're also linked to fertility. They're linked to the inundation of the Nile, which of course is linked to basically the growing of food. And let me remind you that their life cycle requires standing water, so it doesn't happen all the time. It's not really very strange that they developed a whole set of deities around frogs. The one that we recognize the most easily from Budge is Hecate. And down here on the bottom left, we see two hieroglyphs with her name. They're a frog form on the right or a frog head on the left. Now, let me read a little piece from Budge's The Gods of the Egyptians. The frog appears to have been worshipped in primitive times as a symbol of generation, birth and fertility in general. The frog goddess Hecate, or Hecate, was identified with Hathor and was originally the female counterpart of Khnum, by whom she became the mother of Heru-Hur. The great antiquity of the cult of the frog is proved by the fact that each of the four primeval gods, He, Kek, Nau, and Amen, is depicted with the head of a frog, while his female counterpart has the head of a serpent. The cult of the frog is one of the oldest in Egypt, and the frog god and frog goddess were believed to have played very prominent roles in the creation of the world. Now, moving forward a little bit in time, let's talk about Hecate and Mary. So we know from biblical reports that frogs were sacred to the Egyptians. And we know that this is true because when we read the stories of Moses and Aaron in Egypt, the Egyptians, when presented with the plague of frogs, would do nothing about it and left the frogs to be removed by Moses and God. The people, of course, left them alone because they were sacred, most likely because they were sacred to Hecate. Post-Christianity, frogs are still the protectors of fertility. Basically, we see over here a votive tablet from Germany, Bavaria, 1811, where a frog with the vulva on its back is positioned next to the Virgin Mary. One can imagine, in this case, that the frog with the vulva on its back is representative of regenerative force. And we see this representation, or this relationship rather, with frogs and associations with women's genitals, with the vulva, with childbirth, and even with the Sheela-na-gig, which was a subject I was going to dive into, but kind of don't have time. And frogs are found also in the Greek magical papyri. This is one of perhaps the best known Hecate spells, and it mentions Balbo Ferone. I don't want to get too much into that spell. It's a fun one to read because it reminds you that Hecate and Artemis are very, very much overlapped in terms of their epithets and talents, we could say. But Betts and his translators identify the frog as playing an important role as a representative of the gods of the underworld. And looking back to the slide that we just saw on the biology of the frog, that makes sense. The frog is actually undergoing Persephone's trip once a year in this, in this scheme of hibernation and reanimation. Baubo is the name of the witch, one of the witches riding to Walpurgisnacht on a sow in Goethe's Faust. I wanted to bring your attention here to the picture on the left. This photo is from Priene, which is Anatolia, or as Alexander would have called it, Ionia. This particular excavation was pretty well known at the time Crowley was in New Hampshire in the United States. And he probably picked up the fact that Nietzsche refers to Baubo in the opening of The Gay Science, where he's struggling with the fact that women and the truth are the same in some disturbing ways. That's worth looking at, but it's a rabbit hole that we will not disappear down right now. Following the publication of the excavation findings, Freud also mentions Baubo in a mythological parallel to visual obsession in 1916. You can see how all of this stuff kind of overlaps Crowley's development of the ritual time-wise. All right, so let's change tracks a little bit and discuss the fact that to some people, frogs and kings are interchangeable. So we all know the story of the Frog Prince. Most of us know it as the tale where a spoiled princess reluctantly befriends a frog whom she meets after dropping her golden ball into a pond. He retrieves it for her in exchange for her friendship. The Frog Prince, whom we later discover is under a spell, magically transforms back into a handsome prince. That's the kind of net change in the story. In the original Grimm version of the story, the frog spell is broken when the princess gets upset about all the demands he makes, and she throws the frog against a wall, at which point he is magically transformed into a prince. In more modern versions, where we're a little bit more concerned about what children are thinking, the transformation is triggered by the prince kissing the frog. In some other early versions, it was sufficient for the frog to spend the night on the prince's pillow. I think maybe we won't talk too much about that. But the first mention of the Frog Prince actually has nothing to do with the Brothers Grimm or folklore, but instead Petronius. Petronius lived in the 1st century CE and wrote the Satyricon, in which the character Trimalchio remarks, "Qui fit rana nunc est rex," which means the man who was once a frog is now a king. So scholars nowadays, ones who don't have anything better to hassle about, are in one of two camps about this. They could be talking about a predecessor of the Frog Prince story, or other scholars actually think that this is a terrible job at the Emperor Nero, who was often mockingly compared to a frog. And here is an illustration of what that poor princess had to deal with. So in this picture, you'll see the princess staring at the frog, and I drew a little red box around the frog so that you're certain the frog is actually eating off her plate. You see the servants behind giggling, and look at the king. The king is chiding his daughter, telling her that she has to live up to her promises. Recall that she promised, when the frog pulled her golden ball out of the pond, to be his friend, to take care of him. But she got sick of it. She got sick of being told by her father what to do. She got sick of having to feed her potato chips to the frog. And eventually she flies into a rage. She throws the frog, whom she was supposed to care for, into the wall. So it was a little awkward. But we know other spoiled princesses. And here we have a photograph of himself on the left wearing Oh my gosh, it's a leopard skin, perfect for anthysteria. He wrote a fairy tale that we know well, and that would be the Wake World. We know that sort of on the externos end of things, it teaches the path up the tree of life. And we can remember that the protagonist is a girl who often seems like she's about 5, but who is in fact about to be married to the fairy prince, you know, also known as her holy guardian angel. And here's a line straight from the Wake World. And I said, this is the girl speaking, kiss me. And so he said, every step you take is only possible when you say that. This is evidence that Crowley clearly knew about kissing as a method of transformation. And it seems not just possible to me, but probable that the Wake World harkens back to the Frog Prince story that we've just heard. And we know that it was early in the 1900s when the Grimm story was modified, right, to the kissing part, when it was translated into English. And now I'm going to dive into something a little bit different, which is traditional use by witches of toads and frogs. And so this would represent Pliny on this page, but there are plenty of others. Pliny said, by throwing into boiling water a small bone found in the toad's right side, the water will immediately cool. This bone may be found by letting ants eat away the flesh. Another bone has the property of assuaging the fury of dogs, and if put into a drink, of conciliating love and ending discord. Worn too as an amulet, it acts as an aphrodisiac, we are told. And Pliny brings up the fact that these rituals, everything around toad bones, is done in silence. There are no words, no incantations or prayers that accompany the use of the bone amulet. So the bone amulet extends clear back to Pliny Apuleius, very far back, but it also extends forward into the present. Andrew Chumbley has an entire book about this sort of magic. Exceptions to the silence part exist in Chumbley and others. Pliny is also responsible for perhaps the first report of the thing called a toad bone. So toad bones are mythical stones. They're not real because, of course, there are no rocks in the head of even the silliest toad. But they were thought to originate there, and they're largely known as antidotes to poison. The toad bones that are present in museums nowadays are actually the fossilized teeth of an ancient genus of ray-finned fish called Scinstia. There is an entire enormous corpus of work about this, about the production of toadstones, the history of them, and this also exists up to the present day, in spite of the fact that most toadstones are either these fish or pebbles. And now we'll get a little closer to Crowley. What we're looking at here is a quotation from Eliphas Levi, The Mysteries of Magic, and this quotation would be from page 167 and 168, entitled Infernal Evocations. One still more abominable, i.e. ritual, is practiced as follows. A large toad is taken, baptism is administered to it, it is given the name and surname of the person whom it is desired to curse. It is made to swallow a consecrated host, whereon the formula of execration have been pronounced. Then it is enveloped in magnetized objects bound with the hair of the victim, on which the operator has previously spat, and the whole is buried either beneath the threshold of the bewitched person's door or in a place which he is bound to pass daily. The elementary spirit of the toad becomes a nightmare and a vampire for the victim's dreams, unless, at any rate, he knows how to send it back to the malefactor. So here we're getting pretty close to Crowley's at least the external view of Crowley's ritual. It's worth noting that Levy also makes the statement, the sorcerer was almost always a species of human toad, swollen with long-cherished spite. They were poor, rebuffed by all, and consequently full of hatred. Okay, so let's take a little break and kind of sum up. Where are we now? We know that frogs and toads have been considered magical materia, or indeed sacred since antiquity. Compare what we learned about frogs in ancient Egypt with what we know about toad bones, for example, which were largely geared to the control of weather and to livestock, it turns out. Frogs and toads were originally associated with fertility, renewal, changing. Later they were associated with plagues, through the Bible of course, and then poison and antidotes, which we just talked about with respect to toad stones, control over the natural world, toad bones, and love magic, which we didn't really get to. We know that frogs and toads are biologically very odd, and they have the advantage of being roughly person-shaped. I suspect that Crowley knew about early Coptic church equating frogs with Jesus because of some physical archaeological evidence. So let's talk a little bit about that. All right, so this business of Jesus and frogs, we know that in Contra Celsum, it's stated that Jesus looked different to different people. And this is also mirrored on the manuscript shown here on the right. This is On the Life and the Passion of the Christ, an apocryphal account of Jesus, and it's written in Sahidic. And what it says, kind of on the left, it states, "Then the Jews said to Judas, 'How shall we arrest him?' meaning Jesus. For he does not have a single shape, but his appearance changes. Sometimes he is ruddy, sometimes he is white, sometimes he is red, sometimes he is wheat-colored, sometimes he is pallid like ascetics, sometimes he is a youth, and sometimes an old man." So Jesus is recognized as being a person or a being capable of shape-shifting, not unlike a frog. We recognize the kiss of Judas as an identifier that might hail back to the frog king relationship. And we know further in Coptic that Jesus has been related at a later point through to frogs through transformation and resurrection. Further, in the late 1800s, some archaeological evidence was unearthed relating early Christian representation of crosses with frogs. What we're seeing over here on the left-hand side is two oil-burning lamps, one of which has the inscription, "The cross is the support," "Staros to chema" on it, and the other reads, "I am the resurrection, ego eimi anastasis." So these things, they start to relate crosses and frogs, and with the statement, "I am the resurrection," with Jesus. And Crowley would have certainly had access to these publications, or the publications where these two things were described. They were published, as I said, in the late 1800s in New York. So could this be where Crowley was inspired, where he got the name for the ritual? It very well could be. He certainly didn't have too many of his libers that had Greek titles. Okay, so back to the ritual. What happens to Jesus throughout the course of the ritual? Well, we remember that the frog is caught and welcomed like baby Jesus with gold and frankincense and myrrh, and then he's baptized as Jesus of Nazareth. In the ritual, he is worshipped with prayers, and then the operator asks the frog for miracles. And then night comes, where the frog is arrested, the frog is accused of blasphemy and sedition, and he's condemned. And the words of the condemnation in the ritual are the two subsequent bullets. The slave god is in the power of the Lord of freedom, and the age of Horus is arisen by the magic of the master. And then, of course, as we know already, the frog has a bad time of it. He's slain, hopefully prepared into some food and consumed by the operator. The words in the ritual are as follows: "Take into my service the elemental spirit of this frog, to be about me as a lying spirit, as a guardian to me in my work for man." And if we see this as the path to Magus, the 9=2 state, what's required? Well, there's Theophagy and Eucharist. We know for a fact, not just looking at Crowley, but Christianity and everything that lay before, the consumption of a god is probably the best travel road to the assumption of godlike characteristics. You eat the heart of a lion, you become a lion. In the ritual, Crowley evokes and then eats Jesus. Now, Jesus is actually the mercurial spirit that's suggested by the ritual, and you can think about Mercury in all of the different ways, as a psychopomp, as an agent of resurrection, basically. And as I said earlier, the legs were eaten to seal the pact. The burning of the carcass hails back to burnt offerings, even in Homer. But should we see that also as the elimination of the magician before this ritual? We certainly should see this ritual as pushing the eon of the slain god into the eon of the crowned and conquering child. And, lest I forget, I hope that you remember all the way back at the beginning of this presentation that another title of this ritual is the initiation, after all. So then, what of the curse of the Magus? Here we compare side by side Liber B vel Magus and Liber 70. So on the left we see, "In the beginning doth the Magus speak truth, and send forth illusion and falsehood to enslave the soul. Yet therein is the mystery of redemption. The curse of his grade," and this is a little later, "the curse of his grade is that he must speak truth, that the falsehood thereof may enslave the souls of man. And further, the grade of a Magus teacheth the mystery of change." So we've talked a lot about that last part. Why a frog? Well, frogs are changeable. Now, about this business of truth and falsehood, let's look at Liber 70. Early in Liber 70, Crowley states that these are the ceremonies proper to obtaining a familiar spirit of a mercurial nature, as described in St. John the Divine from a frog or a toad. And then in a little bit, he also says, "I assume unto myself and take into my service the elemental spirit of this frog to be about me as a lying spirit, to go forth upon the earth as a guardian to me in my work for man, that men may speak of my piety and my gentleness and all of my virtues, and bring to me love and service and material things soever I may need." Right? And presumably this is a separation between the good cop and the bad cop, if you will. And then the last bullet, which Crowley states a little later, "And this shall be its reward, to stand beside me and hear the truth I utter, the falsehood whereof shall deceive men." So just a word about lying spirits. Why would a person have a lying spirit as a familiar? So this may have to do with Crowley's overall relationship with Jesus. anyone who's a little bit familiar with the Bible knows that in the Old Testament, the lying spirits were typically deceivers. And this would be represented by what we read in Kings, where Ahab was tricked into overconfidence by a lying spirit. In the New Testament, it's a little bit different. Lying generally has involved denying the deity of Christ himself. So this is the biblical look. But for Crowley talks about lying spirits in a couple of different places. We know for a fact, kind of overall, that Jesus was a source of misery and deprivation for Crowley. And then we have the lines from the ritual itself about the slave god and the Lord of freedom. And then think back to the vision in the voice where Crowley in the desert actually invites Choronsan's possession he removes himself from the protective circle and stands in the triangle where Choronsan is about to be invited. So some final thoughts about this ritual. It is very complicated, and nowadays it's ethically problematic. But what we can see by sort of transporting ourselves back to Crowley's time and trying to get in Crowley's head and understand what he knew before he wrote it, we could see this ritual as a way of Crowley overcoming his personal issues with the religion of his parents, and also urging other practitioners to examine, what we would nowadays call their programming. But how did Crowley go about these sort of things? He was all about the radical destruction of boundaries. And one of my favorite lines in Liber 65 is here: "Go thou into the uttermost places and subdue all things. Subdue thy fear and thy disgust, and then yield." So I think this is what Crowley is doing. I think it would be a mistake to consider that Crowley actually liked doing this. He's pushing himself pretty hard here, I would say. I would also say that Liber 70 mirrors Liber B in the description of the Magus and his obligations. And I would like to leave you with the last thought. "And this contemplation shall be performed not by simple meditation, how much less then by reason, but by the method which shall have been given unto him in his initiation to the grade." And I believe that's what this ritual is. And I'd like to leave you with a recipe for frog legs. And that is the end of this talk. Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate having been invited to give it.